Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Professor Pat Barron about dollar hegemony and what might replace dollar hegemony. Professor Barron is a private consultant to the banking industry and teaches an introductory course in Austrian economics at the University of Iowa. He teaches bank management simulation at the Graduate School of Banking at the University of Wisconsin and has delivered numerous presentations at the European Parliament. You can follow his work at patrickbarron.blogspot.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/dollar-hegemony-2. Okay, so now that we've gone through what dollar hegemony means and how it came to be and what some of the implications are of all of that, let's move on and talk about the looming end of dollar hegemony and what might bring it to an end and what might replace it. So let's just start out, especially since this is a fairly new development. But what is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and what role does and can that bank play in the end of dollar hegemony?
Well, I take a little contrary view to a lot of people and say that I think the Asia Infrastructure Bank is a bad idea, and I'm glad the United States didn't get into it. The Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is really created by governments, so they're going to tax their own people one way or the other. Either they outright tax them, or they're going to print their money and found this bank that supposedly is going to go out and fund quote infrastructure unquote projects in Asia or around the world. Well, just ask yourself, how good an investor is a government? A government is not a good investor of funds. I don't think that the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is going to be any better investor of investment or investor of funds and find any better infrastructure projects to fund than anybody else. In fact, I think they will do a poorer job of it because unlike a private bank or a private investment house that would really look at the books and decide whether a rail line in China is worth investing in and what the real rate of return is likely to be and how likely is it to be completed on time and on budget, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank is going to be politically driven. And they're going to want to fund projects politically rather than based upon sound economic developments. This is what's happened in Japan. Japan, for decades, has been investing in infrastructure in Japan, and it appeared that it was working well. But now we know, in hindsight, that a lot of this investment in the high-speed bullet trains are a good example. They go all over the country. In fact, they go places they're not even needed. They go places where there's just no demand for them. But these bullet trains in Japan were funded by the government, and the government was directing all this infrastructure investment, and it was politically driven. So now, the Japanese economy has been in the doldrums for, 25 years now at least. But the whole source of all this doldrums was the fact that a lot of the Japanese investment was politically driven and not driven by private economic views. That is why I am critical of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. I think it's going to be the same thing. I think it's going to be just a worldwide source of corrupt investment. They may point to big projects, some big dam project that's going to provide water or it's going to provide irrigation control to vast areas. Okay, I'm sure the world can do that. It can funnel all its resources into these things, and they can point to the wonderful things that happen there, but at what cost, and what was the alternative that was given up to achieve this? This is something that Austrian economists such as myself are always pointing to, is that you can't just say, well, the government funded some project, a new civic center, or it built a big bridge someplace. And isn't that wonderful? Say, well, yes, but what were the alternatives what was not produced because of that? And if that decision was made politically and not economically, then it's a bad decision, even if you can point to it and say that it did some good. Well, possibly it did some good, but was the bridge that the government built, was it in the wrong place? Was it too big, or was it the wrong size? Was it built properly? Was there any likelihood that the tolls from that bridge are actually going to generate enough funds to pay off the bonds? Many times this just doesn't happen. Whereas private investors really look to all these things and make sure that the people are really getting what they want by how they spend their dollars, instead of the politicians getting what they want, which is votes, by spending the dollars that they take from the people, and then they go out and spend them someplace and point to how they're benefiting this group and they're benefiting that group. So again, getting back to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, I'm glad the United States did not get into it. I'm not sure they did that for the right kind of reasons, but I'm just glad they didn't, because I think it's just going to be a source of wasted capital.
So what does the current pushback look like from countries like China and Russia, and what would a transition period look like if someone were to try and actively change the status quo?
Well, I don't know that the Chinese and the Russians are actually all that interested in bringing down the U.S. or something. I'm not a conspiracy theorist in that regard. I think the Russians and the Chinese want to make money like the rest of the world. I think they want to get rich like the rest of the world. And I do think that they're genuinely concerned about what the United States is doing with the dollar. I mean, if I were them, I certainly would be. So I think what is likely to be the pushback on all this is that, as has been happening, Russia is making separate deals with other trading partners outside of the dollar bloc. They're making deals with Iran, for example. They're making deals with China. They're trying to bypass this dollar hegemony by saying, well, we're not going to use the dollar, we're going to use the ruble. And we're going to keep the ruble stable, and if you keep your yuan stable, then the Russians and the Chinese can come to trading terms that both of them agree to. They can trade with the Indians, the Indians, which is a hugely populous nation. The Indian people have a great love and understanding and appreciation for gold. They probably have more gold in their households per capita than anyone in the world. So they may start trading outside of the dollar. Now, again, when this happens, we get back to sort of the end of the dollar hegemony, in that, well, if there's no reason for the Russian central bank or the Chinese central bank or the Indian central bank to hold large dollar reserves on hand for this to fund all the trading that is going on, if that trading is now going to be done in another currency, then they'll look at those dollar reserves and say, well, there's no reason to hold on to those. When our treasury bills mature, we're just going to tell the U.S. Treasury, we don't want to roll those over into U.S. Treasury bills. We want cash in a bank account at Citibank in New York because we're going to go buy stuff. Well, when that happens, it's going to cause inflation in the United States, because that's the term is, the dollars kind of come flowing home. It means that those dollars, the treasury bills that say the Chinese are holding, are not rolled over to buy more debt. They say, I don't want more. I don't want to hold more treasury bills. I want a checking account at Citibank or Bank of America, and now we're going to go out and buy Burlington Northern Santa Fe Railroad, or we're going to go buy land in the Midwest, or and we're going to cause a great increase in the price of land. People who are owning land may think that's a great thing, but that's what's called, in the modern parlance, that's inflation. That's higher prices, and that's likely to be the biggest problem. The problem will be at the United States, because the rest of the world will only do this if they see that they're going to benefit from it. So the rest of the world will benefit from getting out of from getting rid of the dollar hegemony. I think they were happy with the dollar hegemony as long as they thought that the dollar was sound, but now they know that it isn't. And they're going to start. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, so now they know that it isn't sound, and now they're seeking better arrangements. Not because, I don't think it's because they do not like Americans, or they don't, they envy us, which that could be the case, but so what? If they envy us or they don't like us. I think the reason they will start using some other currency for trading is because it just makes more sense to them, and they're worried about the dollar.
Now, something you mentioned earlier is the possibility of Germany or another Western country being a major contributor to the whole breakdown of dollar hegemony. So what do you think the chances are that Germany leaves the euro and reinstates the Deutsche Mark, and then what would the fallout from that be?
Well, I have been calling for this for a long time. I've been saying that Germans should do this for a long time. I was against Germany giving up the Deutsche Mark because I knew that the euro would just become an inflationary currency. The German Deutsche Mark appreciated against the dollar from the day it was issued. I remember when I was a young officer in the Air Force in the early 70s over in Europe, the exchange rate from the dollar to the Deutsche Mark, you gave $1 and you got about 1.75 Deutsche Mark, or 1.75 Deutsche Marks. And the old guys then, guys who are actually younger than I am now, but the old guys are saying, oh my God, 10 years ago when I exchanged $1 for Deutsche Marks, we got 3 Deutsche Marks to the dollar. And now we only get 1.75 Deutsche Marks to the dollar. So that was an indication that the Germans were running a better monetary system. They were not inflating the Deutsche Mark as much as the U.S. was inflating the dollar. So when the Germans were sort of extorted by the rest of Europe into giving up the Deutsche Marks, or supposedly the rest of Europe was not going to allow Germany to reunite its country after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the Germans decide, okay, we will, if the rest of Europe will allow us to reunite East and West Germany, then we will give up the Deutsche Mark, and we will become a member of the Eurozone. That was a terrible mistake on the Germans' part, but they did it, and you can't go back and relive that, but it was a mistake. In my opinion, when you make a mistake, then you should decide that you should recognize that it was a mistake and fix it. So what's happened is the Germans are running probably the best national economy in the world from the standpoint of their balancing their books. Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany, actually runs a surplus, a federal surplus, if you can imagine that. Everybody else is running a huge budget deficit. Germany, I'm not saying I agree with all of their policies. They're fairly heavily welfare policies, but they're paying for it, and it's their country, and they can run their country the way they want. So they're not, they're running a good economy, but because they're using the euro, and because the European Central Bank is printing euros massively, Germany is being robbed of valuable goods and services, and they're being funneled to the rest of Europe. I think the Germans understand this, but they're also in the same position that the Japanese and, let's say, the South Koreans are in relation to the United States, in that, well, it keeps Germans employed in their Mercedes and Audi factories and all the specialty tools that they produce for the rest of the world. And so they've kind of gotten hooked on this heroin of of euro dollars flooding into Germany to buy valuable goods and services, and then the Germans are running a huge deficit or a huge surplus of euros at the European Central Bank. And there's a website you can go to. I'm trying to think what the name of it is. It's called Target. Target. Target 2. If you just Google Target 2, you'd find that Germany is supporting economically all of the rest of Europe. They're running a massive euro surplus with the European Central Bank, and and all the other countries are running huge deficits with the European Central Bank. So here's what I think would happen. I think Germany should do this, and it's really for the benefit of Europe too, because it would actually be a wake-up call for Europe to reform their economies. Germany should decide to just leave the Eurozone. It doesn't have to leave the European Union. It can still trade freely, have its open borders if it wishes. It can still trade without tariffs and things like that, but it should just say, we are reinstating the Deutsche Mark. If that happened, if they did that, I'm convinced that probably most of the northern tier of Europe would then become Deutsche Mark economies. In other words, Finland, Denmark, Holland, Norway might even do this, and Sweden. They're not even using the Eurozone. A lot of these other countries might give up their currencies, whether it's the euro or their indigenous currencies, and just say, we too are going to use the Deutsche Mark. That is going to be our official currency. It's the same way there are several countries in the world, Panama being one, that use the dollar as the official currency of Panama. Panama does not have its own currency, it just has dollars. And I think if that happened, that would be the end of the euro, and it would be good riddance to a very bad currency. And that within a short period of time, probably all of the rest of Europe would become Deutsche Mark, using the Deutsche Mark, because the rest of Europe would have more confidence in the Bundesbank than they have in the European Central Bank or the Bank of France or the Bank of Italy, for example. So they would all want to give up their local currencies, use the Deutsche Mark, and at that point, that would be good for the dollar, because then our dollar would come under pressure, and our Federal Reserve would have to stop printing dollars. It would force us to print dollars. It would be a non-coercive type of thing. In other words, no one would be forcing the U.S. to do anything special. But if we did not want to have the dollar become practically worthless in relation to a new German Deutsche Mark, we would have to stop printing the dollar and strengthen the dollar. And that would force us to stop these terrible inflationist policies that we have at the Fed. That would be good for us. It would be good for Europe. It would be good for the world. In other words, anything that takes us, our trading partners, and the rest of the world and starts moving us back to a sound monetary system is good, no matter what the transition is going to be. And I'm not trying to poo-poo the transition as being inconsequential. The transition probably will be terrible. But this is something that your listeners should keep in mind. The transition, when the economies go into a recession, this is just revealing the corruption and the rot that is in the economy. The rot is there. We just don't see it. When you reform your currency, when you strengthen your currency, then this rot is revealed. The poor capital investments are revealed. People have to stop spending as much. They have to start saving more. They have to give up their fantasy that we can all live by picking one another's pockets, or we can all live by just printing dollars and helicoptering them around the country and giving it to people. This would be a great benefit to the rest of the world, and I have written several articles encouraging the Germans to do this. I just think that eventually there's been rumors and there have been movements at the Bundesbank and at the Bundestag, which is the German parliament, that Germany take issue with what the European Central Bank is doing, but so far nothing has happened. And so The Germans keep getting outvoted at the board of the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank just keeps initiating new and more and greater inflationist policies that print more euros, that again are robbing Germans of real capital goods. And it's not doing anything at all for the rest of Europe. It is not reforming. It's not causing the economies to expand, other than if they expand at all. It's just only because of rising prices that are called an expansion. But the economies are not getting any better. Unemployment is very high in Europe. A strong Deutschmark, a return of a German Deutschmark and a strong Deutschmark could be the catalyst for almost a worldwide revolution that would reform the monetary system of the entire world. I'm all for it.
What about here at home? Is there any chance of new policies here at home that could also be beneficial? I know people talk a lot about going back to the gold standard. Would that be useful? Are you a proponent of that?
Oh, I'd be very much in favor of that. I just don't think it's going to happen internally. I don't really see enough internal pressure from any strong enough group to make the United States Fed strengthen its dollar, just to plain stop printing the dollar, much less go back on a gold standard. I think it's going to have to be something that comes from outside the United States. I think it's going to have to be something like the Chinese tying the yuan to gold, or the Germans reinstating the Deutschmark and the rest of Europe adopting the Deutschmark, and then the Germans not inflating the Deutschmark so that the dollar starts to deteriorate. Our exchange rate with the Deutschmark starts to go down, 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 and all of our imports start to become more expensive. Then the Fed would be forced to do something for a dollar, to strengthen the dollar. I just see that there's no pressure inside the United States to reform because, again, getting back to who benefits from a weak dollar. Well, so far, we, the American people, have been benefiting from this weak dollar because we're living a higher standard of living than we would have, but only at the sufferance of our trading partners. If our trading partners decided to put an end to it by strengthening their own currency, then we would have to strengthen our own currency too, or we would see massive inflation in the United States. So I think in the long run, it's good for us. It would force us to accept reality. It would force us to live within our means. It would force us to save again. We would start rebuilding the American economy and the American industrial base that has been tremendously harmed in the last several decades. And it would be good for peace in the world. And we would end this dollar hegemony. We would end the American military empire that is disrupting the world. And we could live in peace and harmony again, and we would start rebuilding the real capital base, not only of the United States but of Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world. I see it would be all to the good, but it's got to start with money. I don't see it happening in the United States. I see it happening somewhere else in the world with people who are wiser than we are.
So, what do you think is going to happen? Are we going to see gold play a role in the international monetary system, or are we going to see a return to more local currencies, or are we going to see some sort of global currency or some sort of global system imposed by the IMF? Where do you think all this is headed, and how long do you think the present system can last?
It's hard to say how long it can last. I hate to, I can't give predictions on that, but I would not put it past, the UN or the IMF or someone to try to impose some sort of international currency. It will fail because it's just a desperate measure to try to force the rest of the world to inflate. What I see happening is that I think that there's going to be leaders in the world in other countries. I don't see it happening in the United States, unfortunately. I wish it were, but I see leaders in the rest of the world who are going to put an end to the dollar hegemony, and they're going to not want to go to a super euro or anything or anything like that. They're going to want to get back to sound money and So when you say local currencies, I think they may go back to a German Deutschmark, as I said. There may be a strengthening of the yuan. I think there is a role for gold. I think there's a reason that the Chinese are accumulating gold. And actually, central banks all over the world are accumulating gold. If you recall, 6 months or so ago, maybe a little longer, the Swiss had a big referendum. It failed, but the Swiss National Bank had been selling its gold. And the Swiss people were livid about this. And so they had a referendum to force the Swiss National Bank to stop selling its gold. So there's still in the psyche of the public at large that gold is the ultimate currency. There's only so much gold in the world. You can't manufacture gold out of thin air. You can certainly dig gold out of the ground, and you can refine it and produce it and put it into some form that is useful to man, but it is an expensive process. But gold doesn't tarnish. It doesn't deteriorate. You can dig up. You can find a Spanish galleon that's been sunk in the Atlantic for hundreds of years, dig it up, and the gold coins there will be as bright and shiny as they were the day it sank. It's an amazing metal. It's always been in demand, and I see that at some point in the future the world will return to gold. Unfortunately, I can't give a timetable on that, but I'm confident that at some point gold will return because it will be seen for what it really is, which is the perfect medium of exchange.
Now, before we wrap up, I just want to ask you, since we briefly mentioned the IMF in there, a term you hear thrown around a lot in connection to the IMF as special drawing rights. So what are those, and what role do they play, and what role do you anticipate those playing in the future as we see changes in the current international monetary system?
Well, special drawing rights is really just a basket of currencies. A special drawing right you might think of as the IMF's attempt to have its own, as you said earlier, a world currency, and the SDR, the special drawing right, was sort of an attempt at creating something, but it hasn't caught on. The world doesn't really recognize it. It is used for certain settlements among central banks. But aside from that, it isn't really playing much of a role that I can see. And I don't think there's any role for it in the future, although, again, I don't put it past the IMF from trying to force this on banks or force this on on countries. And you may have central banks that get behind it for a while, maybe the Fed or the European Central Bank, probably the European Central Bank might try to get behind forcing everyone to use special drawing rights, but it's not going to work. Again, really all that is it's a basket of currency that is given a name, and then it says a special drawing right is composed of 50% dollar. I'm just making these numbers up. Let's say 50% dollar, 10% yuan, 10% euro, another 10% British pound, 5% Japanese yen, etc. And then the IMF buys these currencies and creates a demand for them, and then the central banks of the rest of the world can accumulate these special drawing rights and spend them in certain ways. But I think it's sort of a Frankenstein monster that has been lurking around the castle for quite a while now, and it's about ready to die. And I don't put it past the IMF to try and force this on it, but I don't see any role for it at all.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And how can people follow your work if they want to find more?
Well, I post to my own blog, which is patrickbarron.blogspot.com. And I also have my articles, you can find those on Mises.org. That's MISES.org, Mises.org. If you go to daily articles, it'll have where you can click on author, find me listed alphabetically, and I've contributed dozens of articles to Mises.org over the last few years on all kinds of subjects. You can find my essays there about, for example, the Germans reinstating the Deutsche Mark. But I try to keep my essays topical for the topics of the day, and I would, of course, love to have my thoughts more widely disseminated.
Well, before we go, let me just ask you, since this is obviously a very big topic and one that might be new to some of our listeners, are there any specific articles you would recommend people read?
Well, I would recommend, I think if you go to Mises.org, this is the Ludwig von Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. It's really the world's bastion of free market economics. I would recommend you go to that website and you sign up for the daily article. And every day you will get sent to your email box an article that the Mises Institute has picked from people like me who have submitted them. And you will read all kinds of interesting topics, not just about money, but also about free market economics and liberty. And I think you will really get a good education by reading those every day. You can read a daily article in 10 to 15 minutes. They're usually probably around 700 to 1,000 words is about it. Very readable, very nice style, and by some of the world's leading Austrian economists. So that's what I would recommend to your readers, because then you will get a broad picture, not just of the monetary issues, but also how money is used in the whole economy itself. So you don't just narrow into just say, well, I just want to learn about money. Yeah, that's important. But you want to learn about the role of money in the entire economy, because that's not the end all to the thing. And so I think, log on to Mises.org and sign up for the daily article. I don't think you could do anything better than that.
Well, great. I just want to remind everybody to go to wakeupcallpodcast.com/$-hegemony for the show notes page for part 1 of this interview, and wakeupcallpodcast.com/$-hegemony-2 for today's part 2. And I know hegemony can be a difficult word to spell, so it's Hegemony. And those will be the places to find links and resources related to this topic, and as discussed on this 2-part series. So on that note, Professor Barron, thanks again for joining us.
My pleasure, anytime.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.